Canada has just taken the strongest step yet in the North American auto showdown, and this time there is no misreading the message. Ottawa has officially withdrawn from key U.S. auto cooperation agreements, a move that flips decades of automatic alignment and places Canada firmly in control of its own industrial destiny. Washington expected frustration. What it did not expect was a clean, confident break. And tonight, the fallout is hitting the U.S. auto sector harder than any tariff ever could.
The union warns Donald Trump wants nothing less than to surgically destroy Canada's auto sector.
If we don't push back hard against him and against these companies, we're going to lose it all.
The government had exempted both Stellantis and GM from a 25% retaliatory tariff Canada imposed in response to Trump's levies. But it came with conditions.
This escalation did not arrive in a vacuum. Since early 2025, President Donald Trump's Revived America First agenda has reshaped the cross-border landscape with aggressive tariffs aimed at rewriting trade relationships. Auto imports from Canada were suddenly slapped with 25% duties, followed by public threats to raise them to 35% unless Ottawa fell back in line. These measures were marketed as a shield against China, yet the first and most damaging impact landed squarely on Canada, home to one of the most tightly integrated auto ecosystems on Earth. As Reuters and AP have repeatedly confirmed, companies reacted quickly. Stellantis pulled production out of Ontario and shifted it to Illinois, a corporate retreat that cost thousands of Canadian jobs and triggered immediate political outrage. GM began to scale down operations in Ingersoll as EV demand softened and U.S. policy grew more unpredictable. Meanwhile, the U.S. refused to offer clarity, stability, or even a pause to assess the consequences of its decisions. Prime Minister Mark Carney's government warned that Canada would not remain passive. Over the summer and fall, Ottawa reduced tariff-free import allowances for American automakers, launched dispute proceedings over Stellantis' withdrawal, and tied future privileges directly to domestic investment. But this week's announcement goes beyond tactical retaliation. Canada is stepping out of the old North American auto mindset entirely. Ottawa is suspending cooperative frameworks, freezing new sector agreements, and replacing the long-standing playbook with a fully Canadian industrial strategy built around security, independence, and reliability.
For 3 decades, the auto sector moved like a single organism. A car assembled in Michigan might carry an engine cast in Ontario and electronic components built in Quebec. Borders mattered politically, but not economically. That system depended on trust, the kind of trust that survived disagreements, elections, and policy cycles. Trump's tariff regime shattered the principle beneath that trust. Canadian-made parts were no longer recognized as North American value. They were treated as foreign liabilities. Even U.S. analysts described it as economic friendly fire, a policy aimed at China that managed to hit Canada first. Once that line was crossed, Ottawa understood that maintaining the old arrangement meant accepting permanent vulnerability. Withdrawal became less a choice and more an act of national self-respect.
This shift is not emotional. It is not reactionary. It is a meticulously planned repositioning of Canada's industrial footing. Carney's government is making it clear that cooperation must now be earned, not assumed. U.S. automakers will no longer receive special exemptions for simply showing up in Canada. Access to the Canadian market and Canadian labor must be matched by genuine investment, long-term commitments, and demonstrated stability. Instead of anchoring its future to an increasingly volatile U.S. policy environment, Canada is widening its field of partners. Carney's Asia-focused diplomacy, reinforced by new economic channels with South Korea, Japan, and even the unexpectedly productive APEC meeting with Xi Jinping, signals a shift toward diversification. Reliable partners are welcome. Unpredictable ones will not shape Canada's economy again. The irony is striking. Trump's tariffs were designed to protect American jobs, yet they are now destabilizing the very companies they were meant to defend. The U.S. auto industry has long depended on seamless access to Canadian parts, engineering, and materials. When those links are disrupted, production delays spread rapidly. A component stuck at the border forces assembly lines to slow. A surge in Canadian prices inflates the cost of an American-built SUV. The slightest uncertainty causes investment plans to freeze. Bloomberg reports that U.S. automakers are already facing higher operating costs and increasingly complex supply chain hurdles. The industry cannot build competitive cars without predictable partners, and right now, the United States is the least predictable actor in the North American market. This is not Canada damaging the U.S. auto sector. It is the United States damaging itself, and Canada simply refusing to take the blow in silence.
Behind closed doors, Canadian officials now refer to the USMCA as a zombie deal, technically alive but hollowed out by unilateral American decisions. A trade agreement cannot function when one country rewrites rules without consultation, especially in an industry as integrated as autos. By stepping back from auto cooperation arrangements, Canada is not abandoning USMCA. It is responding to the reality that the United States abandoned the spirit of the agreement long ago. As North America argues, Asia is quietly positioning itself as the world's most reliable manufacturing bloc. South Korea is expanding global defense industrial partnerships. Japan is deepening long-term EV battery alliances. ASEAN economies are emerging as essential mid-stage production hubs. Even China, despite tensions, is ready to court Canadian investment with offers of stability and scale. For Canada, this is less a pivot and more a rebalancing. For the U.S., it is a warning. Global leadership is never guaranteed, and reliability is now a global currency. If America chooses chaos, others will choose opportunity.
For years, Canada tolerated disrespect disguised as negotiation. It endured being labeled a national security threat over steel and aluminum. It watched the U.S. weaponize access to its own market. It absorbed corporate withdrawals justified by American politics, not economic logic. This withdrawal is the clearest declaration yet that Canada is finished playing the junior role. The country is not isolating itself, it is reclaiming its agency. Carney's message is simple. Canada will cooperate when cooperation is mutual, not when it is expected. Canada's decision to withdraw from U.S. auto cooperation is not a rupture, it is a restoration of balance. After a year of tariff pressure, broken commitments, and unpredictable policy swings, Ottawa has acted with a confidence that reflects both its national interest and its global potential. The road ahead will not be simple, but the direction is unmistakable. Canada is done waiting for Washington to treat it like a partner. From now on, Canada chooses its own path, its own terms, and its own future. The real question is whether the United States is prepared to adapt to a North American landscape where Canada is no longer the quiet neighbor, but an independent power that knows its worth.
While President Trump makes progress on trade in Asia, he is currently icing out America's neighbor to the north, announcing an additional 10% tariff on Canada, apparently irked by a TV ad paid for by the Canadian province of Ontario, an ad that ran on U.S. TV network.
Furious Canada just hit back at Donald Trump in a way no one saw coming. The U.S. president exploded over an anti-tariff ad that went viral across America. He slapped a new 10% tariff on Canadian goods. It was meant as punishment, but Ontario Premier Doug Ford did not apologize. He called the ad the most successful campaign in North American history.
Do you have any regrets about stirring the pot, possibly making things harder on your fellow Canadians due to this retaliation from President Trump?
No, I don't believe so. The person that started this whole thing around the world, not just with Canada, is President Trump. And the American people are finally feeling the effects of tariffs.
While Trump lashed out, Ford stood firm. Instead of retreating, he used the moment to tell Americans that tariffs on Canada are really taxes on themselves. In a few sentences, Ford turned a trade dispute into a public reckoning, and this time the political punch came from the North.
Ford's message was simple but devastating. He reminded Americans that protectionism always backfires. He pointed to hard numbers, not political slogans. Over the past 5 months, U.S. manufacturing employment had fallen steadily, while inflation climbed above 4%, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics. Those are the exact indicators Trump once promised to fix. Ford's campaign wasn't about insults or theater. It was a calculated move to speak directly to American households who now feel the cost of Trump's tariffs every time they shop or fill up their tanks. And the method was brilliant. By borrowing words once spoken by Ronald Reagan in 1987, Ford used a conservative icon's own warning to expose the danger of Trump's policy. What began as a television spot became a statement of economic logic. When the United States taxes its closest trading partner, it is its own workers who pay first.
Trump's response only magnified Ford's message. His outburst gave the Ontario campaign a reach no advertising budget could ever buy. The ad ran during the World Series, but the real audience came afterward when American media replayed the story across primetime. By morning, headlines across CNN, Reuters, and Politico called the video a direct challenge to Trump's trade agenda. The more the president tried to silence the message, the louder it echoed. Inside the White House, officials framed the new tariff as necessary protection. Outside, economists called it self-inflicted damage. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce warned that the latest duties could slow factory activity across the Midwest, especially in states like Michigan and Ohio that depend on cross-border supply chains. What Trump meant as a show of strength became proof of his vulnerability. Canada and the United States are not just neighbors. Their economies are literally built into one another. Every day, roughly $2 billion in goods cross the border, according to Statistics Canada. Car parts move from Windsor to Detroit, then back again for final assembly. Ontario steel feeds factories in Illinois, Indiana, and Pennsylvania. When tariffs disrupt that cycle, American plants face higher input costs. A study by the Peterson Institute for International Economics found that each 10% tariff on metal imports adds nearly $300 to the average cost of an American-made vehicle. Multiply that across the entire auto sector, and the result is thousands of layoffs, not job gains. Ford's warning now looks prophetic. By trying to punish Canada, Trump is punishing the very workers he promised to defend. In a globalized supply chain, there is no such thing as a one-sided victory. Every tariff creates collateral damage, and this time, most of that damage is landing inside U.S. borders. Imagine what would happen if Canada decided to step back. Without Canadian nickel, aluminum, potash, and uranium, American factories and farms would feel the shock almost overnight. Data from Natural Resources Canada show that the United States buys more than 60% of Canada's nickel and 75% of its potash output. These are materials essential to manufacturing, energy, and agriculture. If that flow slows or stops, prices in the U.S. surge and production timelines stretch. Detroit's assembly lines would stall within weeks. American farmers would face fertilizer shortages just as harvest season peaks. Importing replacements from Asia would take months and cost far more. Canada doesn't need to threaten retaliation. The structure of the North American economy is already its shield. Ford's calm but defiant stance reminded everyone that Canada's strength lies in its reliability, and removing that reliability is the one thing the U.S. can't afford. After the controversy exploded, Prime Minister Mark Carney chose a measured tone. He paused the Ontario campaign to reopen trade talks, signaling that Canada still values stability over spectacle. But Ford held his line. He said no one could demand that Ontario stay silent while local jobs were at risk. The two approaches may look different, but they work in tandem. Carney plays the diplomat, keeping doors open in Washington. Ford plays the fighter, showing that Canada won't be bullied. Together, they form a strategy that combines restraint with resolve. While the United States is divided between outrage and defense, Canada is showing something rare: coordination under pressure. In this standoff, it is the quieter country acting with the louder purpose. Ford's viral campaign sent more than a message to Trump. It sent a warning to every policymaker in Washington. Canada is not a sidekick in North American trade. It is an essential partner that powers the U.S. economy, from energy to autos to agriculture. If Washington continues to weaponize tariffs against allies, it risks driving those allies toward new partnerships. Already, Ottawa is deepening trade with Japan, South Korea, and ASEAN nations, exploring alternative routes that reduce its dependence on the U.S. market. Trump's second term was meant to restore American dominance, but every new tariff pushes the U.S. further into isolation. America First is quietly becoming America alone. The question now is not whether Canada can adapt, it already is, but whether the U.S. can survive without the stability that partnership brings.
In just a few days, a 60-second ad from Ontario transformed a policy debate into a moment of truth for the entire continent. It showed that words, when backed by data and conviction, can shake even the most powerful office in the world. Canada's response was not loud or angry. It was measured, factual, and unmistakably firm. Trump may hold the pen that signs tariffs, but Ford now holds the story that defines them. The irony is clear. A campaign meant to defend America's economy has ended up exposing its dependence on the very neighbor it tried to punish. Ford didn't need to shout or threaten. He just told the truth, and that truth hit harder than any tariff could. In this trade war, Canada didn't throw the first punch, but when it did, it landed perfectly.
U.S. Commerce Secretary Howard Lutnick, meanwhile, threw cold water on the idea of a comprehensive deal on autos this week.
So we're going into an approach where we are doing one at a time, but at the same time, we will continue to fight for our auto workers. That's clear.
This week, the name Melanie Joly, Canada's industry minister, has dominated national headlines. Fresh from her trip to Washington, she promised to fight for every Canadian job, declaring that Ottawa would not allow American tariffs to undermine the country's manufacturing backbone. Her tone was calm, but her message carried the weight of defiance. Canada would no longer play defense in a game written by Washington.
Is there any prospect of either reductions in American auto tariffs on Canadian autos or an auto deal of any sort? Is there any prospect of either of those things?
So listen, I won't go into the details of the negotiation. What you heard from the Prime Minister is at this point is we're looking to have a deal on steel, aluminum, and also energy projects. So this is what is being worked on. But we know also that we need one on auto, and we need one on copper, and we need one also on lumber.
North America's economy once moved with the precision of a shared engine. Factories in Ontario fed assembly lines in Michigan, and raw metals crossed the border daily without friction. Then came a political shift that changed the rhythm. The United States turned inward, rewriting its trade rules and forcing every neighbor to adjust. In Washington, new tariffs hit key sectors: steel, aluminum, autos, copper, and softwood lumber, shaking the foundation of industries that had sustained Canada's middle class for decades. What began as a campaign to strengthen U.S. manufacturing quickly became a test of endurance for Canada's export economy. In Ottawa, the response was not loud or reactive, it was strategic. Melanie Joly returned from the White House with a clear message: Canada would adapt. She spoke about protecting every Canadian job, not through retaliation, but through reconstruction. The country would rebuild its industrial base from within, treating Washington's pressure as proof that depending on one market had reached its limit. That moment marked a quiet turning point. The story was no longer about negotiation in the Oval Office. It became about how Canada would rewrite its economic identity when the rules of trade were no longer predictable. While headlines focused on failed talks and stalled auto deals, Joly's team was shaping a broader plan. Her industrial strategy rested on three coordinated pillars: protection, production, and prosperity, each designed to anchor jobs that once floated on the tides of U.S. policy. The first pillar focused on protecting existing industries. Instead of subsidies, Ottawa used public procurement to guarantee domestic demand for Canadian steel and aluminum, ensuring that workers in Hamilton and Saguenay kept their furnaces running despite higher export costs. The second pillar centered on producing new capacity. The federal government directed billions into defense manufacturing, clean energy, and advanced nuclear technology, including the Darlington SMR reactor in Ontario. Each project aimed to absorb displaced workers and create high-skilled positions that could not be outsourced. Canada's 2025 federal budget confirmed an additional 9 billion Canadian dollars for defense, raising total spending to 2% of GDP, aligning with NATO commitments while securing long-term industrial employment. The third pillar looked outward, attracting investment and talent. By leveraging Canada's vast reserves of critical minerals, nickel, lithium, and rare earths, the plan invited global investors to fund mining and processing projects to serve the EV and technology sectors. Every detail of Jolie's framework reflected a single idea: self-reliance as strategy. Canada was not withdrawing from globalization. It was redesigning its place within it. Ironically, Washington's pressure made that redesign politically possible. As Canada implemented its plan, the effects began to ripple south. American factories that once relied on low-cost Canadian components faced rising input prices. Reports from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce in late September 2025 showed that Midwest manufacturers were dealing with delayed shipments and increased transportation costs under the new tariff structure. In Michigan and Ohio, auto suppliers warned that margins were shrinking as raw materials from Canada became more expensive. Yet instead of moving production to the United States, several mid-sized firms renewed contracts north of the border, where stable energy prices and predictable investment policies offered better conditions. Meanwhile, Canadian provinces moved fast. Ontario and Quebec accelerated approvals for new energy and infrastructure projects, from the LNG Phase 2 expansion in British Columbia to the Port of Montreal upgrade. Federal-provincial coordination created thousands of construction and engineering jobs, offsetting the drag from weaker exports. For Washington, this was an unintended consequence. The policy meant to bring manufacturing home had pushed America's closest partner to develop independent supply chains. The result was a reordering of North America's industrial map, not a collapse, but a quiet redirection of flow. By autumn 2025, Statistics Canada reported a 3.3% year-over-year increase in wages and 60,000 new jobs in September alone. The unemployment rate remained high at 7.1%, yet analysts from the Conference Board of Canada describe the trend as a stabilization phase driven by domestic investment rather than exports. The shift was economic, but it also carried political weight. For the first time in years, Canada's growth narrative no longer began with what Washington decided. By October 2025, Melanie Joly had become more than a cabinet minister. She embodied a new kind of Canadian economic leadership, calm, assertive, and grounded in realism. Her call to fight for every job was no longer rhetoric. It had become a framework for rebuilding. The government's defense industrial strategy promised work for welders, engineers, and researchers. Energy expansion through LNG and nuclear projects aimed to meet domestic needs while opening future export routes to Europe and Asia. Infrastructure investments like the Port of Montreal symbolized the shift from reaction to creation. Canada's economic map was changing. Regions once dependent on resource exports were now attracting technology and manufacturing investment. The country's long-standing dependence on U.S. demand was finally being balanced by deliberate diversification. Across the border, the picture looked different. Higher costs and disrupted supply chains were squeezing American mid-tier manufacturers. The Federal Reserve's Industrial Output Report for October 2025 noted a 0.4% decline in auto sector productivity tied to disrupted imports. A policy meant to protect American jobs had instead exposed the deep interdependence between the two economies. The symbolism was unmistakable. A plan built to control a neighbor had sparked that neighbor's independence. As the U.S. turned inward, Canada turned outward. Ottawa chose reconstruction over retaliation, proving that quiet strategy can outperform loud politics. And as 2025 draws to a close, the story is no longer about tariffs or White House meetings. It is about two neighbors moving in opposite directions, one struggling to rebuild through isolation, the other finding strength through adaptation. The paradox is clear. America's attempt to assert power became the reason Canada found its own. What began as an economic shock ended as an industrial awakening, a moment when pressure turned into purpose and Canada rediscovered the power of building for itself.
The U.S. ambassador to Canada was on the defensive in Halifax, accusing Canada of playing hardball when it comes to trade talks. Pete Hoekstra repeatedly told the Halifax Chamber of Commerce that Canada has it wrong, saying this isn't a trade war.
I would suggest that he gets a mirror and looks in it, because the issues that are between the U.S. and Canada are caused by the U.S.
Trade tensions between the United States and Canada have dragged on for months, fueled by President Trump's reciprocal tariffs. Into this already heated atmosphere came U.S. Ambassador Pete Hoekstra speaking in Halifax. He tried to calm the waters, insisting this was not a trade war but only negotiations. He went further, saying Canadians lacked passion for the relationship with America. Instead of reducing tension, his words hit like a spark in dry grass. What was meant to soften the debate only hardened attitudes. For many Canadians, it sounded dismissive, even insulting.
Well, when you kick the dog, you can't blame it for snarling back. When you talk about annexation and you talk about a 51st date and you treat your partner like a second class.
All I know is I don't want to cross over right now to the U.S.
The reaction was immediate and emotional. Ordinary Canadians pushed back, accusing Washington of gaslighting. They pointed out that tariffs imposed by Trump were the true source of pain. People expressed their frustration in daily choices. More Canadians now choose to shop at home rather than cross the border. Statistics Canada reported that in August 2025, cross-border car trips returning from the United States fell by 34% compared to the previous year. U.S. alcohol sales inside Canada have declined, while Canadian book sales are up. Even trade flows show the impact. Canadian exports to the U.S. have dropped about 2% this year, equal to a $5 billion loss. These are not abstract numbers. They represent families in border towns, businesses losing revenue, and communities shifting their habits. Hoekstra's remarks only reinforce the sense that Canadians must close ranks and protect their own market.
We have the ambition, but a deal is a deal, and a deal has to go for both sides, and Canada will agree a deal that's in the best interest of Canadians. It should not surprise anyone, including the U.S. ambassador, who's doing a very good job, I would add. Thank you. For America.
Against this backdrop, Prime Minister Mark Carney responded. He did not shout or escalate. Instead, he drew a clear line. Carney said Canada would only pursue agreements that benefit Canadians, not deals designed in Washington. The so-called bigger deal suggested by the ambassador, covering steel, energy, and critical minerals, is not on the table unless it clearly serves Canada's interests. Carney reminded audiences that the USMCA already provides a functioning trade framework. While consultations with businesses are underway in all three countries, Ottawa is not desperate for a new bargain. Canada, he emphasized, has options. From deepening ties with Mexico to expanding trade with Europe and Asia, diversification is already shaping the future. The contrast could not be sharper. Hoekstra looked frustrated, searching for passion that is no longer there. Carney appeared as a steady statesman, reassuring Canadians that their sovereignty and industries will not be sacrificed. Carney's approach also resonated internationally. European and Asian partners have taken note of Canada's stance, interpreting it as a sign that Ottawa is serious about building a diversified trade network.
By staying calm while Washington complained, Carney not only strengthened his hand at home, but also signaled abroad that Canada is a stable, reliable partner. This matters in a global economy where investors and governments alike are searching for certainty in the face of Trump's unpredictable swings. In the end, what was meant to downplay conflict has backfired. Hoekstra's remarks exposed Washington's frustration rather than Canada's weakness. Instead of dividing Canadians, they united public opinion and highlighted the real costs of Trump's tariffs. Canada now looks more confident, more willing to say no, and more determined to chart its own course. The optics are striking. The United States, once seen as the senior partner, now appears petty and defensive. Canada, once accused of being too reliant, now projects resilience and choice. Families who remember the sting of tariffs hear their leader promise not to repeat old mistakes. Workers see that their government is prepared to defend jobs and industries. This is the new reality of the relationship. Canada will negotiate only as an equal. Washington's pressure tactics no longer work. Instead of shaming Canadians into compliance, Hoekstra has shown how far America's leverage has slipped. Trump's tariff play, meant to force concessions, has left the United States isolated, while Canada grows stronger in conviction and strategy. Halifax will not be remembered for easing tensions, but for exposing U.S. frustration and Canada's resolve. What Trump called economic warfare has instead built resilience in Ottawa and unity among citizens. Canada's message is clear. It will work with the U.S. only as an equal, never on weaker terms.